What would you do if the person who abandoned you suddenly reached out with a life-changing proposition? In A Promise for Tomorrow, Clara Renard, a struggling artist in Paris, is confronted with a shocking letter from her estranged father, a man she hasn't seen in over a decade. Philippe Renard, a wealthy but emotionally distant figure, offers her an unthinkable deal: to raise his unborn child. Caught between her resentment for the man who left her behind and her own financial struggles, Clara takes the leap, returning to his sprawling countryside villa, a place filled with painful memories and unresolved wounds. But what begins as a cold, transactional arrangement quickly unravels into a deeply emotional journey of healing, trust, and love. As secrets from the past resurface, Clara must confront her father's mistakes, her own doubts, and the true meaning of family. Will they find redemption before time runs out? Stay with us as this moving story unfolds, where every decision carries the weight of a legacy and every bond is put to the test. The light in Clara Renard's cramped Parisian apartment was dim, the kind that blurred the edges of reality and dreams. A single beam of sunlight pierced through the gap in her threadbare curtains, falling directly on the letter in her trembling hands. She had stared at it for hours, the sight of her estranged father's name in neat, practiced handwriting pulling her into a spiral of memories she had worked so hard to bury. Philippe Renard. The name was both familiar and foreign. She had once whispered it in prayers as a little girl, begging for her father to return after he walked out of her life. Later, she had cursed it during the sleepless nights when she struggled to pay rent in the shadow of his immense wealth. Now, seeing it on the envelope in front of her, her emotions wavered between anger and curiosity. Her chest tightened as she traced the elegant strokes of his name. What could he possibly want after all these years? Had he suddenly remembered the daughter he left behind? She wanted to tear the envelope apart, but found herself hesitating, as though it contained a Pandora's box she wasn't sure she wanted to open. Finally, with shaking fingers, she slid the letter opener through the seal and unfolded the heavy cream-colored paper. The letter began, as if dictated to an assistant. "Dear Clara, I hope this letter finds you in good health. I know my reaching out may come as a surprise, given the distance that has grown between us over the years." Clara snorted bitterly. Distance was a generous way to describe his abandonment. Still, she continued reading, her breath catching as the letter dove into the reason for his sudden contact. Philippe wanted her to raise his unborn child, a child conceived through surrogacy. The words were clinical, detached, the kind of language that made the proposition feel more like a business transaction than a familial gesture. In exchange, he promised her financial security, something Clara had never known. Her fingers tightened around the paper. A child, her father, a man who had failed to raise his own daughter, was now asking her to be the guardian of his heir. The irony stung, but as she glanced around her tiny apartment, she knew why she couldn't ignore his offer. The cracked walls, the stack of unopened bills on her kitchen counter, the half-finished canvas leaning against the window, each was a reminder of her struggles as an artist in a city that chewed up and spat out the weak. But was she truly desperate enough to accept? Clara placed the letter on the table and leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. Could she trust him? Did she even want to see him again? The thought of standing face to face with Philippe, of hearing his voice and seeing those cold, calculating eyes, made her stomach churn. Yet, beneath the bitterness, a seed of curiosity took root. What kind of man had he become? Did he regret leaving her and her mother all those years ago? Or was this proposition just another one of his manipulative schemes? The evening stretched into night, and the letter remained on the table, untouched but impossible to ignore. Clara tried to distract herself, picking up a paintbrush and adding hesitant strokes to the canvas by the window. She painted the outline of a lone figure walking into a foggy abyss, but her mind was elsewhere. By the time dawn broke over Paris, bathing the city in pale golden light, Clara had made her decision. She placed the letter back into its envelope and tucked it into her worn leather bag. Whatever anger she held toward Philippe, this was an opportunity she couldn't afford to refuse. Perhaps it would lead to answers. Perhaps it would give her closure. Or perhaps it would open wounds she had tried so hard to heal. The train ride from Paris to the French countryside was long and silent, save for the occasional announcements over the intercom. Clara stared out the window, watching as the urban sprawl gave way to rolling green fields and quaint villages. Her fingers tapped nervously against her knee, her mind replaying the last words her father had said to her before he disappeared from her life. "This is for the best." She was only 10 years old when he left. Her mother had tried to shield her from the pain, pretending everything was fine, but Clara knew better. She remembered the nights her mother cried herself to sleep, and the mornings she forced a smile for her daughter's sake. Philippe Renard had chosen his ambition over his family, and Clara had spent the past 2 decades trying to fill the void he left behind. The train finally pulled into the station, and Clara stepped onto the platform, her suitcase in hand. The countryside air was crisp and cool, a stark contrast to the smog-filled streets of Paris. A black car waited for her at the edge of the station, and a driver stepped out to greet her with a polite bow. "Miss Renard," he said, taking her suitcase. "Mr. Renard is expecting you." The car ride to the villa was quiet, the only sound being the hum of the engine and the occasional chirping of birds. Clara's heart pounded as the car approached the estate gates, which creaked open to reveal the sprawling Renard villa. It was exactly as she remembered, grand, imposing, and suffocating. The stone facade was covered in ivy, and the tall windows gleamed in the sunlight. Philippe was waiting for her at the entrance. He looked older, thinner, but his sharp features and piercing gaze were unchanged. He greeted her with a nod, his expression unreadable. "Clara," he said simply. "Philippe," she replied, refusing to call him father. He led her into the villa, his footsteps echoing on the polished marble floors. The grandeur of the place was overwhelming, but Clara couldn't help noticing how lifeless it felt. The furniture was pristine, the paintings perfectly aligned, but there was no warmth, no sign of a home. Philippe ushered her into his study, a room filled with dark wood shelves and expensive decor. A single photograph sat on the desk, a picture of a much younger Philippe holding Clara as a baby. The sight of it made her chest ache. They sat across from each other as Philippe began to explain the arrangement. His voice was calm, almost robotic, as he outlined the terms of the contract. Clara would live in the villa and take full responsibility for the child's upbringing. In return, Philippe would ensure her financial stability and leave her a portion of his estate. "This isn't about fixing the past," he said bluntly. "It's about ensuring the future." Clara clenched her fists. "And what about the present? Does that mean anything to you?" Philippe's expression didn't change. "The present is temporary. The future is permanent." His words stung, but Clara forced herself to stay composed. She signed the contract, her hand shaking slightly as she pressed the pen to the paper. Later that night, she lay awake in her old bedroom, staring at the ornate ceiling. The walls, painted a soft blue, seemed to echo with whispers of the past. She thought of her mother, of the life they could have had if Philippe had stayed. But those thoughts were pointless now. What mattered was the choice she had made. And yet, as she closed her eyes, a single question lingered in her mind. What kind of man had Philippe become? The morning sunlight spilled through the tall windows of the villa, painting the polished marble floors with streaks of gold. Clara sat in the dining room, a grand space filled with an air of formality that felt suffocating. The table stretched long enough to host 20 guests, yet only 2 places were set, hers and Philippe's. Breakfast was a quiet affair, the clinking of silverware the only sound between them. Philippe sat at the head of the table, meticulously cutting into his toast as if it were a task of great importance. His composure was unnerving, his every movement deliberate and calculated. Clara, seated a few chairs down, pushed her food around on her plate, her appetite dulled by the tension hanging thick in the air. "We'll begin the process soon," Philippe said abruptly, breaking the silence. His tone was as cold and detached as ever. The surrogate mother is due to arrive in a few days. You'll be briefed on everything then. Clara stiffened, her fork clattering against her plate. You make it sound like a business meeting, she said, her voice sharp. Philippe looked at her, his expression unchanging. This is a matter of legacy, Clara. Sentimentality has no place here. Legacy. The word grated on her nerves. It was all he ever seemed to care about. And what about the child? She asked, leaning forward. Do you even care about them as a person, or are they just another extension of your empire? Philippe's jaw tightened. The child will have everything they need. That is what matters. Clara shook her head, her frustration bubbling to the surface. It's not just about what they need. It's about love, Philippe. Do you even understand what that means? The question hung in the air like a challenge. For a moment, Clara thought she saw something flicker in Philippe's eyes. Regret, perhaps, or hesitation, but was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the same stoic mask he always wore. This discussion is over, he said, standing abruptly. The arrangements have been made, and I expect you to fulfill your role without further argument. He left the room without another word, his footsteps echoing down the hall. Clara sat back in her chair, her appetite entirely gone. She felt trapped in a situation she had willingly entered, yet now questioned at every turn. The following days passed in a blur of preparations. Clara met with the surrogate mother, a quiet woman named Elise, who carried herself with a calm dignity. The interactions were brief and clinical, overseen by Philippe's ever-efficient staff. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that everything about this arrangement was too detached, too mechanical. One evening, as she wandered the villa's sprawling gardens, she found herself drawn to the chestnut trees that lined the estate's edge. Their tall, sturdy trunks and rustling leaves brought a sense of grounding that the cold walls of the villa couldn't offer. She sat beneath one of the trees, the earthy scent of the soil, and the distant hum of cicadas calming her racing thoughts. "What am I doing here?" she whispered to herself, running her fingers through the grass. She thought of her life in Paris, the messy, chaotic, but undeniably hers. Here, she felt like a cog in a machine, her role reduced to fulfilling someone else's vision. But then she thought of the child, of the life that would soon enter the world. Could she be the one to give them what Philippe never gave her, love, warmth, and a sense of belonging? The thought filled her with both hope and fear. That night, she returned to the villa with a newfound resolve. If she was going to stay, it wouldn't be just to honor the contract. She would be there for the child, to ensure they grew up knowing they were more than just a part of Philippe's legacy. But as she climbed the grand staircase to her room, she couldn't ignore the weight of doubt pressing on her chest. Could she really do this? Could she navigate the icy waters of Philippe's world and still hold onto her own sense of self? For now, all she could do was try. The morning air in the village was crisp and refreshing, a stark contrast to the heavy atmosphere of the villa. Clara had decided to venture into the nearby town, partly to escape Philippe's suffocating presence and partly to see what life beyond this state was like. She wandered through cobblestone streets lined with charming cottages and flower stalls, her footsteps light for the first time in days. As she entered the local bakery, the warm scent of fresh bread and pastries enveloped her. The woman behind the counter, a cheerful middle-aged baker with flour-dusted hands, greeted her with a wide smile. "You must be the Renard daughter," she said, her tone friendly but laced with curiosity. Clara stiffened. "Yes, I'm Clara," she replied, keeping her voice polite but guarded. The baker's smile faltered for a moment before she quickly recovered. "We've heard a lot about your father. He's quite the figure around here." Clara nodded, unsure how to respond. She could feel the eyes of the other customers on her, their whispers just loud enough to reach her ears. "Do you think she's here because of the inheritance?" one voice murmured. "I heard he's planning something big," another added. "She's probably involved." Clara's cheeks flushed as she quickly paid for her bread and exited the shop. The whispers followed her down the street, a constant reminder that her presence here was anything but unnoticed. Later that day, as she sat on a bench in the town square, a soft voice broke through her thoughts. "Are they giving you trouble already?" Clara looked up to see a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile standing in front of her. She appeared to be in her early 30s, her brown hair tied back in a loose braid. "I'm Leah," the woman said, extending her hand. "I'm the local midwife." Clara shook her hand, grateful for the friendly gesture. "Clara," she replied, "though I suppose everyone here already knows that." Leah chuckled. "Small towns are like that, but don't let the gossip get to you. Most of them mean well, even if they have a funny way of showing it." The two women fell into an easy conversation, Leah's warmth a welcome contrast to the cold detachment of the villa. Clara found herself opening up about her frustrations with Philippe and the weight of the arrangement she had agreed to. Leah listened intently, her expression thoughtful. "Sounds like you've got your hands full," she said after a while. "But if you ever need someone to talk to, or just a break from the madness, you know where to find me." Clara smiled, feeling a small but significant sense of relief. Maybe she wasn't entirely alone in this after all. The evening cast long shadows across the villa's sprawling gardens, where Clara often wandered to clear her thoughts. The chestnut trees whispered in the wind, their rustling leaves a faint comfort in the otherwise silent estate. She found herself gravitating toward them more frequently, escaping the oppressive weight of the house and her father's cold presence. Inside the villa, the atmosphere was no less daunting. Philippe had retreated to his study after dinner, as he often did, leaving Clara to her own devices. She had grown accustomed to the echoing halls and the silence that followed their brief, transactional conversations. Yet, something about tonight felt different. He seemed quieter, more withdrawn, though she couldn't pinpoint why. As the hours ticked by, curiosity got the better of her. She approached the study, hesitating outside the heavy oak doors. The faint glow of a desk lamp seeped through the cracks, and she could hear the faint shuffle of papers. Taking a deep breath, she knocked softly and pushed the door open without waiting for a response. Philippe looked up from his desk, his piercing eyes narrowing slightly at the intrusion. "Clara," he said, his voice carrying a mix of surprise and annoyance. "Is there something you need?" For a moment, she considered leaving. The room, with its dark wood paneling and walls lined with bookshelves, felt like a fortress, his fortress. Yet, her gaze caught on something unexpected, a framed photograph on the desk. It was old, the colors faded, but unmistakable. It was a picture of a younger Philippe holding a baby, her, as an infant. Clara stepped closer, her eyes fixed on the photograph. "I didn't know you kept that," she said quietly. Philippe's expression softened, though he quickly masked it. "It was taken a long time ago," he replied, his tone neutral. She picked up the frame, studying the image. The man in the photo seemed almost unrecognizable compared to the cold, distant figure sitting before her now. "Why do you keep it?" she asked, her voice tinged with curiosity. Philippe hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers. "I suppose it's a reminder," he said finally, "of what I had and what I lost." The admission caught her off guard. Philippe was not one to show vulnerability, and the weight of his words hung heavily in the air. Clara set the photo back on the desk, her emotions a tangled mess of anger, sadness, and a flicker of understanding. "You lost it because you left," she said, her voice steady but filled with pain. "You didn't have to." Philippe looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You think it was easy," he said, his tone sharper now. "Walking away was the hardest thing I've ever done." "Then, why did you?" she demanded, her frustration spilling over. "Why did you leave us if it was so hard?" He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Because I was a coward," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I was doing what was best for you and your mother. I don't know what I thought." Clara stared at him, her heart pounding. She had waited years to hear those words, to hear any acknowledgement of the pain he had caused. Yet, now that she had, it didn't feel as satisfying as she had imagined. Instead, it left her feeling hollow, as if the scars of the past were too deep to heal with a simple admission of guilt. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said finally, her voice trembling. "But I'm here now, and I'm trying." Philippe nodded, his gaze meeting hers for the first time. "That's all I can ask." For the first time, the distance between them felt a little smaller. It wasn't reconciliation, not yet, but it was a step towards something that might resemble understanding. Days passed, and life in the villa settled into a quiet routine. Clara busied herself with preparations for the baby's arrival, working closely with Leah, who had become an unexpected source of support. The midwife's warmth and wisdom were a welcome contrast to the cold formality of Philippe's world. One morning, as Clara helped organize the nursery, a sudden commotion in the villa shattered the calm. She rushed downstairs to find Philippe slumped in a chair, his face pale and his breathing labored. One of the staff members was already on the phone with a doctor, while another fetched water. "Philippe," Clara exclaimed, kneeling beside him. "What's wrong?" He waved her off weakly. "It's nothing," he said, though the pain in his voice betrayed him. The doctor arrived quickly, examining Philippe with a stern expression. Clara stood nearby, her hands clenched into fists as she watched helplessly. After what felt like an eternity, the doctor turned to her. "He's pushing himself too hard," he said. "His health is fragile, and he needs a rest. Stress will only make it worse." Clara's stomach dropped. She had noticed Philippe's declining energy and his occasional bouts of fatigue, but she had chalked it up to age. Now, it was clear there was more to it. Later that evening, as she sat with Philippe in his study, she decided to confront him. "You're sick, aren't you?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. Philippe didn't answer at first. He stared out the window, his gaze distant. Finally, he said, "It's not important." "It is to me," Clara insisted. "If I'm going to be part of this, if I'm going to help raise this child, I need to know what's going on." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "I've been diagnosed with a heart condition," he admitted. "The doctors say it's manageable, but I don't have as much time as I'd like." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. For all his faults, Philippe had always seemed larger than life, untouchable. The thought of him being vulnerable, mortal, was unsettling in a way she hadn't expected. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because it doesn't change anything," he said. "My focus is on ensuring the future, the child's future. That's why I need you, Clara." She shook her head, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. "You need me, but you can't even be honest with me." Philippe looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something raw in his eyes, fear. "I didn't want you to feel obligated," he said. "I thought if you knew, you might leave." His vulnerability caught her off guard, and for a moment, the walls between them seemed to crumble. She didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded, her emotions a whirlwind of anger, sadness, and a flicker of compassion. As she left the study that night, she realized something. Philippe wasn't just fighting for the child's future. He was fighting his own battles, ones he rarely let anyone see. And in that moment, she decided she wouldn't let him face them alone. The days following Philippe's health scare passed slowly, with the villa shrouded in an almost eerie quiet. Clara found herself walking on eggshells around him, unsure of how to navigate the newfound fragility in their relationship. The man she had always seen as cold and impenetrable was now undeniably vulnerable, and it unsettled her. In the mornings, Philippe worked from his study. Though Clara noticed he often paused to rest or lean back in his chair, his breathing labored. She had offered to help him manage some of his affairs, but he brushed her off with a curt, "I can handle it." His refusal to accept help frustrated her, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that it stemmed from fear rather than pride. One afternoon, as Clara wandered through the villa's library, a place she had rarely visited as a child, she stumbled across a box tucked away in the corner of a shelf. The box was unmarked, its simple wooden exterior giving no clue to its contents. Curiosity piqued. She opened it to find a stack of letters, their envelopes yellowed with age. The first letter she opened was addressed to her mother, written in Philippe's unmistakable handwriting. The words inside were raw and full of regret, a stark contrast to the detached man she knew. He had written about his struggles with balancing his growing empire and his family, his fears of failure as a father, and his guilt for leaving. Clara's chest tightened as she read. There were dozens of letters, each one revealing a side of Philippe she had never seen, one that was vulnerable, conflicted, and deeply human. He had written these letters but never sent them, leaving them to gather dust in the corners of his empire. As she sifted through the letters, her emotions oscillated between anger and sadness. Why hadn't he said these things when it mattered? Why had he let his fears and guilt dictate his actions instead of fighting for his family? She took the letters to Philippe's study that evening, placing the box on his desk with a firm thud. He looked up from his papers, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What's this?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "You tell me," Clara replied, crossing her arms. Philippe hesitated, his gaze lingering on the box before finally meeting hers. "You shouldn't have gone through my things." "I wasn't looking for them," she shot back. "But I found them. And now I need to know. Why didn't you send them? Why didn't you tell us how you felt?" Philippe leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Because words mean nothing without actions," he said. "And at the time, I didn't think I was capable of giving you or your mother what you deserve." Clara shook her head, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "So you just left? You let us think you didn't care?" "I thought it was the kinder option," he admitted, his voice quiet. "I didn't want you to grow up resenting me more than you already would." "Well, congratulations," Clara said bitterly. "It worked. I grew up resenting you anyway." Her words hung in the air, cutting through the silence like a blade. Philippe flinched, and for the first time, he looked genuinely remorseful. "I know I can't change the past," he said, "but I'm trying, Clara. I don't know if it's enough, but I'm trying." Clara wanted to yell at him, to tell him that trying wasn't enough after everything he had put her and her mother through. But instead, she just nodded, the weight of her emotions too heavy to unpack in that moment. Clara's relationship with Philippe remained fragile, a delicate balance of tentative understanding and lingering resentment. But there was one person in the villa who seemed intent on disrupting that balance: Jacques Moreau, Philippe's longtime lawyer. Jacques had been with Philippe for years, handling everything from business deals to estate planning. Clara had met him briefly when she first arrived, but his demeanor had been cold and calculating, with a faint air of disdain that made her uneasy. One morning, Clara overheard a hushed conversation between Jacques and one of the household staff. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the mention of her name stopped her in her tracks. "She has no experience," Jacques was saying, his tone laced with disdain. "Philippe is making a mistake trusting her with something this important. She'll ruin everything." Clara's fists clenched as she listened. She didn't know what everything entailed, but was clear that Jacques didn't believe in her, or more likely, didn't want her involved at all. Later that day, she confronted Philippe about Jacques' comments. "Why do you keep him around if he doesn't trust me?" she demanded. Philippe sighed, rubbing his temples. "Jacques has been loyal to me for years," he said. "He's cautious, yes, but his intentions are good." "Are they?" Clara countered. "Because it sounds like he's trying to undermine me." Philippe didn't respond, his silence more telling than any words he could have said. The tension with Jacques came to a head a few days later when Leah visited the villa to discuss the final preparations for the baby's arrival. As they sat in the parlor, reviewing medical details, Jacques entered the room unannounced. "Miss Renard," he said, his tone clipped. "A word." Clara exchanged a glance with Leah before following Jacques into the hallway. He led her to Philippe's study, closing the door behind them. "I'll get straight to the point," Jacques said, his voice sharp. "I don't think you're fit to take on this responsibility." Clara bristled. "And what gives you the right to decide that?" "Your track record speaks for itself," Jacques replied. "You've spent your life as a struggling artist, barely scraping by. You have no experience raising a child, let alone one who will inherit a legacy like Philippe's." Clara's cheeks flushed with anger. "This isn't about the legacy," she shot back. "This is about the child. And I'm not going to let you or anyone else stand in the way of giving them the love and care they deserve. Jacques sneered. Love doesn't pay the bills, Miss Renard. And it certainly doesn't secure a future. Before Clara could respond, the door opened, and Philippe stepped into the room. His expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. That's enough, Jacques, he said firmly. Clara is staying, and she has my full support. Jacques looked as though he wanted to argue, but he simply nodded and left the room, his jaw tight with frustration. Clara turned to Philippe, her anger still simmering. Why do you let him talk to me like that? She demanded. Philippe sighed. Jacques is protective, sometimes overly so, he said. But I'll make it clear to him that you're not to be questioned again. Clara nodded, though she couldn't shake the feeling that Jacques' interference wasn't over. The next morning, the atmosphere in the villa was tense. The confrontation with Jacques lingered in Clara's mind like a storm cloud. She couldn't shake the feeling that his disdain for her ran deeper than mere skepticism. His loyalty to Philippe seemed unquestionable, yet his view of her was nothing short of disdainful, as if her presence disrupted a long-established order. Clara wandered the villa's gardens, hoping to calm her nerves. The rows of chestnut trees swayed gently in the breeze, their branches reaching skyward like quiet sentinels. Yet, even the beauty of the estate couldn't erase her unease. She had come here for the child, to fulfill a role she was still figuring out for herself. But every step forward seemed to place her deeper into a labyrinth of judgment and hidden motives. When she returned to the villa, she found Philippe sitting in the drawing room, a book resting on his lap. His health seemed to be deteriorating more quickly than she had anticipated. His skin was pale, and his frame appeared thinner than before. Yet his sharp mind and authoritative demeanor remained intact. Philippe, she said, breaking the silence, we need to talk about Jacques. He raised an eyebrow, setting the book aside. What about him? Clara hesitated, unsure how far to push. He doesn't trust me. He's trying to undermine me at every turn. Philippe leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Jacques has been with me for years. He's always been protective of my interests. And where do I fit into that? Clara countered, her voice firmer than she expected. I'm not some threat to your estate. I'm trying to help. Philippe regarded her for a long moment before speaking. Jacques doesn't know you the way I do. Clara stiffened. Do you know me, Philippe? Because from where I'm standing, it feels like you don't. Her words hung in the air, sharp and challenging. For a moment, Philippe looked as though he might argue, but then his gaze softened. Perhaps not as well as I should, he admitted, but I trust you more than Jacques does, and that should count for something. Before Clara could respond, the door to the drawing room opened, and Leah entered, her expression urgent. You need to come outside, she said, her voice tight. Now, outside, a small crowd had gathered near the estate gates. Clara recognized several of the villagers, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern. At the center of commotion stood Jacques, addressing the crowd with a commanding voice. Philippe Renard has entrusted his legacy to someone who has no experience, no qualifications, and no stake in the future of this estate. Jacques declared, his tone sharp and cutting. Clara felt a surge of anger rise in her chest. She pushed through the crowd, her heart pounding. That's enough, Jacques, she shouted, her voice carrying over the murmurs of the villagers. The crowd turned to her, their eyes wide with surprise. Jacques smirked, clearly enjoying the attention. Ah, Miss Renard, he said, his tone mocking. Care to explain why you're the best choice to raise this child? The people deserve to know. Clara's hands balled into fists, but she forced herself to stay calm. This isn't about qualifications or legacies, she said, her voice steady. This is about giving a child love, stability, and a family. Something you clearly don't understand. A murmur ran through the crowd, some villagers nodding in agreement. Jacques, however, wasn't finished. And what happens when the money runs out, Clara? When this so-called family falls apart? Will you still be there? Before Clara could respond, Philippe's voice rang out, clear and commanding. That's enough. The crowd parted as Philippe approached, his cane tapping against the ground with each step. Despite his frailty, his presence was as imposing as ever. He stood beside Clara, his expression firm. "Clara is here because I asked her to be," he said. "She has my full confidence, and anyone who questions that is questioning me." Jacques paled, his confidence faltering. The crowd began to disperse, their whispers fading into the background. Philippe turned to Jacques, his voice low and steady. "We'll speak later." As Jacques retreated, Clara felt a surge of relief, though it was tempered by the realization that this battle was far from over. Philippe turned to her, his expression softening. "You did well," he said. "Don't let him get to you." Clara nodded, though her mind was already racing. Jacques wasn't going to stop, and she needed to be ready for whatever came next. Weeks passed, and the tension with Jacques became a quiet undercurrent rather than an open conflict. Clara focused her energy on preparing for the baby's arrival, immersing herself in tasks that felt tangible and meaningful. She spent hours with Leah, learning everything she could about caring for a newborn. The nursery, once a cold and empty room, began to take shape. A crib adorned with soft blankets, shelves filled with storybooks and toys, and walls painted a calming shade of green. One evening, as Clara and Leah sat in the parlor, sipping tea and discussing the baby's due date, a movement caught Clara's eye. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but then she saw it again, a slight ripple beneath the fabric of Elise's dress. "Was that?" Clara asked, her voice filled with wonder. Elise, the surrogate mother, smiled warmly. "The baby's first kick," she said, placing her hand on her belly. "Would you like to feel?" Clara hesitated for a moment before nodding. She placed her hand gently on Elise's stomach, her breath catching as she felt the faint, fluttering movement beneath her palm. It was a moment of pure magic, one that brought tears to her eyes. "She's strong," Elise said softly, "just like her mother." The words took Clara by surprise. "I'm not her mother," she said, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "You will be," Elise replied, her tone firm but kind. "You already care about her. That's what matters." Clara didn't know how to respond. The idea of being a mother, of taking on that role, still felt overwhelming. But as she sat there, her hand resting on Elise's belly, she felt a spark of something she hadn't expected: hope. As the days turned into weeks, Clara's bond with the unborn child grew stronger. She found herself talking to Elise about the future, imagining what the baby might be like. Would she have Philippe Sharpwit, Clara's stubborn determination, or would she carve her own path entirely? But with that hope came a growing sense of responsibility. This wasn't just about fulfilling a contract or pleasing Philippe. This was about a life, a child who would depend on her for everything. The weight of that realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. One night, as Clara sat in the nursery, she found herself whispering to the baby, her voice soft and filled with emotion. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," she admitted, "but I promise I'll do my best to be there for you, always." The calm after the confrontation with Jacques was short-lived. While Philippe's public defense of Clara silenced the villagers' whispers for a time, the tension within the villa only deepened. Jacques kept his distance. His presence felt more in his absence. A calculated move, Clara suspected, as if he were waiting for the right moment to strike again. Clara buried herself in preparing for the baby's arrival, but the weight of Philippe's declining health and the shadow of Jacques' interference loomed large. One afternoon, as she arranged the final touches in the nursery, Leah arrived with a furrowed brow. "We need to talk," Leah said, closing the door behind her. Clara set down the stuffed toy in her hands and turned to face her friend. "What's wrong?" "It's Jacques," Leah began, her voice low. "I heard from one of the villagers that he's been meeting with lawyers in secret. There's talk of him trying to contest Philippe's plans, specifically the part where you're named as the child's guardian." Clara's heart sank. She had anticipated resistance from Jacques, but this felt like an outright betrayal. "Can he do that?" she asked, her voice shaking. Leah hesitated. "It depends. If he can argue that you're unfit, or that Philippe isn't a sound mind, he might have a case, but would be messy and damaging. Clara felt the walls closing in. Why would he go this far? She murmured, more to herself than to Leah. Leah placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Jacques sees himself as the gatekeeper of Philippe's empire. He doesn't trust you because you're not part of the world he's used to controlling. Clara nodded, her resolve hardening. Then I need to prove him wrong. That evening, Clara confronted Philippe in his study. He sat at his desk, the flickering light of the fireplace casting shadows across his tired face. I heard about Jacques, Clara said, skipping any preamble. Philippe looked up, his expression unreadable. What about him? He's trying to undermine me. Again, she said. Leah told me he's been meeting with lawyers. Philippe sighed, leaning back in his chair. Jacques has always been cautious. Overly so, at times. This isn't caution, Clara snapped. This is sabotage. Philippe's eyes narrowed slightly, but he said nothing. Clara pressed on. If you trust me, Philippe, you need to make it clear, to Jacques, to everyone, that I'm here to stay. Otherwise, this entire arrangement is going to fall apart. For a long moment, Philippe said nothing, his gaze fixed on the fire. Then, slowly, he nodded. You're right. I'll handle it. Clara wanted to believe him, but a knot of doubt remained in her chest. Jacques wasn't someone who gave up easily, and she knew this fight was far from over. The next morning, Clara found Philippe waiting for her in the drawing room. He looked older than she had ever seen him, the lines on his face etched deep with fatigue. But there was a softness in his eyes that caught her off guard. Walk with me, he said, motioning toward the garden. They strolled in silence for a time, the gravel crunching under their feet. The air was cool, the scent of blooming flowers mingling with the faint smell of rain. Clara kept her hands in her coat pockets, waiting for Philippe to speak. I owe you an apology, he said finally, his voice low but steady. Clara blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. What? I've made a lot of mistakes, Philippe continued, his gaze fixed on the path ahead. With you. With your mother. I thought I was doing the right thing by leaving. That you'd be better off without me. Clara felt her chest tighten. You thought abandoning us was the right thing to do. Philippe stopped walking, turning to face her. I know how it sounds, but at the time, I believed I was sparing you from the worst parts of me. I was so focused on building my empire, on achieving success, that I convinced myself you didn't need me. And you were wrong, Clara said, her voice trembling with suppressed emotion. We needed you, Philippe. I needed you. I know, he said, his voice breaking. And I'm sorry, Clara. I'm sorry for all the ways I failed you. Clara stared at him, her emotions a whirlwind of anger, sadness, and something else, something softer. She had waited years to hear those words, and now that she didn't know how to feel. I don't know if I can forgive you, she said finally. Not yet. Philippe nodded, his expression solemn. I don't expect you to, but I hope, in time, we can find a way forward. Clara said nothing, but as they continued their walk, a flicker of hope ignited in her heart. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for them to rebuild what had been broken. Later that evening, as Clara sat in the nursery, she found herself reflecting on Philippe's words. For all his flaws, he was trying, something she never thought she would see from him. And as she ran her fingers over the edge of the crib, she realized that perhaps she was trying too. The whispers in the village resurfaced with renewed vigor as news of Jacques' interference spread. Clara couldn't step outside the villa without feeling the weight of judgmental stares and hushed conversations that followed her down the cobblestone streets. It was as if her every movement was being scrutinized, her intentions questioned at every turn. One morning, Clara walked to the local market to pick up a few supplies. The narrow streets were bustling with vendors and villagers, their lively chatter fading to murmurs as she approached. She could feel their eyes on her, the weight of their suspicion pressing down like a physical burden. She's only here for the money, one voice whispered. Poor Philippe. Trusting someone like her, another added. Clara clenched her jaw, trying to block out the noise. But as she turned a corner, she was stopped by an elderly woman with kind but piercing eyes. "Miss Renard," the woman said, her voice gentle but firm, "you must understand. People here are protective of Philippe. He's done much for this village, and they don't want to see him hurt." Clara nodded, choosing her words carefully. "I understand their concern, but I'm not here to hurt him. I'm here to help." The woman studied her for a moment before nodding. Time will tell. Actions speak louder than words. Back at the villa, Clara vented her frustration to Leah over tea in the parlor. "No matter what I do, they'll always see me as an outsider," she said, her voice laced with exhaustion. "They don't know you yet," Leah replied, her tone soothing. "They only know the version of you that Jacques is painting. If you want to change their perception, you need to show them who you really are." "How?" Clara asked, leaning back in her chair. "It feels like no one's willing to listen." Leah smiled. "Not everyone is against you. There are people here who see beyond the rumors. Start with them." The opportunity came sooner than Clara expected. That weekend, the village held its annual Harvest Festival, a lively event filled with music, food, and laughter. Clara was hesitant to attend, but Leah convinced her it was the perfect chance to connect with the community. As Clara walked through the festival, she felt a mix of unease and determination. She stopped at a booth run by a local craftsman, admiring the intricate wood carvings on display. The man behind the counter, a burly figure with a thick beard, gave her a cautious nod. "Beautiful work," Clara said, picking up a small carved bird. "Did you make these yourself?" The man's expression softened slightly. "I did. Been doing it for years." "They're incredible," Clara said sincerely. "Do you take commissions?" The man seemed surprised but pleased. "I do." "What are you looking for?" Clara described a custom mobile for the nursery, her enthusiasm shining through despite her nerves. By the time she left the booth, the man was smiling, and Clara felt a small glimmer of hope. Maybe Leah was right. Maybe she could win over the villagers, one step at a time. The day of the baby's birth arrived in a whirlwind of activity. Clara woke to the sound of hurried footsteps and the faint cry of pain echoing through the villa. Elise had gone into labor during the night, and the household staff was already scrambling to prepare for the delivery. Clara rushed to Elise's side, her heart pounding with both excitement and fear. Leah was already there, her calm demeanor a steadying force amidst the chaos. "She's progressing quickly," Leah said, glancing at Clara. "It won't be long now." Elise's cries grew louder, and Clara felt a surge of helplessness. She had read all the books, asked all the questions, but nothing could have prepared her for this moment. "What can I do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Just be here," Leah said, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "She needs to know she's not alone." Clara nodded, taking Elise's hand in hers. "You're doing amazing," she said softly. "Just keep breathing." Hours passed in a blur of tension and anticipation. Finally, a sharp cry pierced the air, and Clara felt her breath catch as Leah held up the tiny, squirming bundle. "It's a girl," Leah announced, her voice filled with warmth. Clara's hands shook as Leah placed the baby in her arms. She looked down at the newborn, her tiny face scrunched in protest at the bright lights of the room. Tears filled Clara's eyes as an overwhelming wave of love washed over her. "Welcome to the world, little one," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Later that evening, as the villa settled into a hushed calm, Clara sat in the nursery, cradling the baby in her arms. Philippe entered the room quietly, his steps slow and deliberate. He stood beside her, his gaze fixed on the child. "She's perfect," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. Philippe nodded, his expression unreadable. "She is." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the weight of everything unspoken hanging between them. Finally, Philippe broke the silence. "Thank you, Clara, for being here." Clara looked up at him, her heart swelling with a mix of emotions. "I'm not just here for her," she said. "I'm here for you too, whether you believe it or not." Philippe didn't respond, but the faint flicker of emotion in his eyes was enough for Clara to know her words had reached him. As she looked back down at the baby, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was the beginning of something new, something worth fighting for. The joy of the baby's arrival was short-lived as Jacques struck his next blow. Just days after the birth, Clara was served with legal documents challenging her guardianship over the child. The court date was set, and the villa once again fell under the shadow of uncertainty. Clara paced the nursery, her anxiety mounting with each passing day. The baby, now named Amélie, lay peacefully in her crib, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around her. Clara couldn't imagine losing her now, not after everything they had been through. She had bonded with Amélie in ways she hadn't thought possible, and the thought of Jacques tearing them apart was unbearable. Philippe, though frail, was determined to stand by her side. "Jacques has overstepped," he said, his voice firm despite the weakness in his body. "We'll fight this, Clara, together." The day of the hearing arrived, and the tension was palpable as they entered the courthouse. Jacques sat on the opposite side of the room, his smug expression making Clara's blood boil. The courtroom was filled with villagers, their whispers filling the air like static. Clara felt exposed, as if her entire life were on trial. Jacques' lawyer began the proceedings with a scathing argument, painting Clara as an unfit guardian with no experience or stability. He emphasized her struggles as an artist, her lack of financial independence, and her estranged relationship with Philippe as evidence that she was incapable of raising Amélie. Clara clenched her fists, her anger simmering beneath the surface. But as her own lawyer presented her case, she felt a spark of hope. They highlighted her efforts to prepare for the baby's arrival, her dedication to creating a loving home, and Philippe's explicit trust in her. When it was Philippe's turn to speak, the room fell silent. He rose slowly from his seat, leaning on his cane for support, and addressed the court with a voice that was both steady and filled with emotion. "I have made many mistakes in my life," he began, his gaze sweeping across the room. "But trusting Clara is not one of them. She is my daughter, and she has shown a strength and resilience that I can only admire. Amélie deserves a future filled with love, and I believe Clara is the one who can provide it." His words hung in the air, a powerful testament to his faith in Clara. Even Jacques seemed momentarily stunned by the raw honesty in Philippe's voice. The judge deliberated for what felt like an eternity before delivering the verdict. Clara held her breath as the words rang out. "Guardianship remains with Clara Renard." Relief washed over her as the room erupted in murmurs. Jacques stormed out of the courtroom, his face dark with anger, but Clara didn't care. She had won. Amélie was hers. The aftermath of the courtroom battle brought a sense of calm to the villa, though the victory was bittersweet. Philippe's health had taken a turn for the worse, the stress of the trial leaving him weaker than ever. Clara spent her days caring for both him and Amélie, the weight of her responsibilities heavy but purposeful. One evening, as she sat with Philippe in the drawing room, he handed her a leather-bound journal. "This is for you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara opened the journal to find pages filled with handwritten notes, sketches, and reflections. It was a record of Philippe's life, his thoughts, and his dreams, a legacy he wanted to pass on to her. "I started this years ago," he said. "I wanted you to know, to understand who I was beyond the mistakes." Tears filled Clara's eyes as she flipped through the pages. There were entries about his struggles as a young entrepreneur, his regrets about leaving her and her mother, and his hopes for the future. It was the most personal thing he had ever given her. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "I'll treasure this." Philippe smiled faintly, his eyes filled with a mix of pride and sadness. "You've given me something I never thought I'd have again, Clara. A family." The days turned into weeks, and Philippe grew weaker with each passing moment. Clara often found him in the nursery, sitting quietly by Amélie's crib, his eyes filled with a bittersweet longing. He spent his remaining time bonding with the child, telling her stories of his youth and singing lullabies in his soft, gravelly voice. One afternoon, as the sun cast golden rays across the villa, Philippe asked Clara to join him in the garden. They sat beneath the chestnut trees, the air filled with the scent of blooming flowers. "You've done more than I ever could have asked," Philippe said, his voice faint but sincere. "You've given Amélie a future I can't be part of, and you've given me peace." Clara placed her hand over his, tears streaming down her face. "You're a part of this, Philippe. You always will be." He nodded, his gaze distant. "Promise me something, Clara. Promise me you'll live your life fully, for yourself and for her. Don't let my mistakes hold you back." "I promise," Clara said, her voice firm despite the ache in her chest. Philippe passed away that evening, peacefully in his sleep. Clara found him in his bed, a faint smile on his face, as if he had finally found the peace he had long sought. She held his hand and wept, the weight of both loss and gratitude pressing down on her. The days after Philippe's passing were a haze of quiet grief and introspection. The villa, once filled with tension and unspoken words, now seemed unbearably silent. Clara found herself wandering its halls late at night, searching for traces of her father in the spaces he had left behind. His absence was palpable, and though they had only begun to reconcile, it felt as though she had lost something far greater than she had realized. In the nursery, Clara sat by Amélie's crib, watching her sleep. The baby's soft breaths were a reminder of the life Philippe had entrusted to her. The journal he had given her lay open on her lap, its pages filled with his reflections and regrets. One entry in particular caught her eye, written in his sharp, deliberate handwriting. To Clara, "I've spent my life building walls. Walls to protect myself, walls to keep others out. But those walls kept me from the one thing I needed most: family. I hope, in time, you can forgive me for the hurt I caused. And I hope you know how proud I am of the woman you've become." Tears blurred her vision as she traced the words with her fingertips. It was the closest Philippe had ever come to expressing his love for her, and it was enough. For the first time, she felt a sense of closure, though the ache of his loss remained. Leah visited the villa often, helping Clara navigate the overwhelming responsibilities of raising Amélie. One afternoon, as they shared tea in the garden, Leah broached a topic that Clara had been avoiding. "What will you do now?" Leah asked gently. Clara sighed, her gaze fixed on the chestnut trees swaying in the breeze. "I don't know," she admitted. "This place, it feels like a part of me now, but at the same time, it's tied to so much pain. Maybe it doesn't have to be," Leah said. "Maybe it can be a place of healing, for you and Amélie." Clara considered this, her thoughts drifting to the villagers who had once viewed her with suspicion. Slowly but surely, she had begun to win their trust, building connections that felt genuine and lasting. Perhaps staying here wasn't such a far-fetched idea after all. That evening, as Clara explored the villa's library, she stumbled upon another hidden box tucked behind a row of books. Inside were letters Philippe had written to her mother but never sent. The words were filled with regret and longing, revealing a side of him that Clara had only glimpsed in his final days. She read through them, her heart heavy with the weight of his unspoken feelings. One letter stood out, written shortly after he had left. "My dearest Marianne, I thought leaving would spare you and Clara the pain of watching me fail. But now, I see that my absence has caused far greater harm. I don't know if I'll ever have the courage to say this to you in person, but please know that I've never stopped loving you or our daughter." Clara closed the letter, tears streaming down her face. She felt a strange mix of sorrow and solace, knowing that despite his mistakes, Philippe had carried a deep love for them both. The decision to stay in the villa came gradually, like the dawning of a new day. Clara realized that leaving would feel like running away from everything she had built with Philippe, Amélie, and even the villagers. Instead, she chose to honor her father's memory by creating a life in the place he had once called home. She began by opening the villa to the community, inviting the villagers to weekly gatherings in the gardens. These events quickly became a staple in the village, bringing people together and transforming the once intimidating estate into a hub of connection and warmth. Clara also dedicated herself to preserving Philippe's legacy in a way that felt true to both of them. She used her skills as an artist to design a gallery in the villa, showcasing not only her own work, but also pieces from local artists. The gallery became a space for creativity and inspiration, a testament to the new life she was building. One afternoon, as Clara prepared for the gallery's grand opening, she found herself standing in front of Philippe's portrait in the study. She had thought about removing it, but something about it felt important to keep. It wasn't just a reminder of him. It was a reminder of how far they had come. Amelie, now a few months old, babbled happily in her arms. Clara smiled down at her daughter, feeling a deep sense of purpose and gratitude. "We're going to be okay," she said softly, pressing a kiss to Amelie's forehead. The gallery opening was a resounding success, drawing visitors from neighboring towns and bringing a sense of vibrancy to the village. As Clara stood among the guests, she felt a sense of fulfillment she hadn't known was possible. Later that evening, as the villa grew quiet once more, Clara sat beneath the chestnut trees with Amelie in her lap. The stars above sparkled like diamonds, and the air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers. For the first time in years, Clara felt at peace. Philippe's absence still lingered, but it no longer felt like a void. Instead, it was a presence, a quiet reminder of the man who had finally found his way back to his family, even if it was too late to stay. The days passed, blending into weeks as the villa transformed into a place of warmth and life. Clara threw herself into her new role as Amelie's mother and the steward of Philippe's legacy. The weekly gatherings in the garden had become a cornerstone of village life, drawing people together in ways Clara hadn't anticipated. She had begun to see familiar faces soften with kindness instead of suspicion, and the quiet smiles of the villagers made her feel like she belonged. One morning, Clara sat in the nursery, watching Amelie play with the mobile crafted by the local woodworker. The delicate carvings of animals spun gently above the crib, casting shadows that danced on the walls. Amelie reached out a tiny hand, her delighted giggles filling the room. "Do you like it, sweetheart?" Clara asked softly, brushing a curl from her daughter's face. Amelie responded with another happy babble, her laughter like music to Clara's ears. It was moments like this that made everything worth it. The legal battles, the grief, the self-doubt. Despite the peace she was finding, there were moments when the weight of her responsibilities felt overwhelming. Running the villa and the gallery, raising a child, and maintaining her connection with the village often left her exhausted. But Leah remained a steadfast presence, always ready with a helping hand or a kind word. One afternoon, as they sat together in the gallery, Leah looked around at the vibrant paintings and sculptures that filled the space. "You've done something incredible here," she said, her voice filled with admiration. Clara smiled, though her expression was tinged with humility. "I didn't do it alone. You had the vision," Leah replied, "and that's what brought everything together. You've turned this place into more than just a home. It's a sanctuary for everyone." Clara's heart swelled at the words. She hadn't realized just how much the gallery and the gatherings had come to mean to the village. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was truly making a difference. That evening, as Clara stood in the garden with Amelie in her arms, she thought about the journey that had brought them here. The pain and anger she had carried for so long had started to fade, replaced by a sense of purpose and fulfillment. "I think we're going to be okay, Amelie," she whispered, pressing a kiss to her daughter's forehead. Amelie cooed softly, her tiny fingers gripping Clara's shirt. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a promise, a quiet reassurance that they were building something beautiful together. The anniversary of Philippe's passing came with an unexpected heaviness. Clara found herself walking through the villa, memories of her father's final days flooding back. Though their time together had been brief, it had left an indelible mark on her, shaping the woman and mother she was becoming. She spent the morning in the study, reading through Philippe's journal once more. His words felt like a conversation across time, a bridge connecting them despite his absence. As she read, she found herself smiling at the entries filled with his dreams for Amelie's future and the hopes he had held for Clara to find her own happiness. Later that day, Clara gathered the villagers for a small memorial in the garden. It was a simple affair, just a few words of remembrance and gratitude for the man who had brought them all together in unexpected ways. As she spoke, Clara felt a deep sense of connection, not just to Philippe, but to the community he had loved and supported. Philippe wasn't perfect, she said, her voice steady despite the emotion welling up inside her. But he cared deeply, even if he didn't always know how to show it. And in the end, he taught me that it's never too late to try, to heal, and to love. The villagers nodded in quiet agreement, their expressions a mixture of respect and understanding. When the memorial ended, they lingered in the garden, sharing stories and laughter that filled the air with life. That evening, Clara sat beneath the chestnut trees with Amelie in her lap, the stars shining brightly above them. She looked down at her daughter, her heart full of love and hope for the future. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" she said softly. Amelie responded with a sleepy coo, her tiny hand resting against Clara's chest. Clara smiled, her gaze drifting to the villa behind them. It no longer felt like a place of pain or isolation. It was a home, a true home, filled with love, laughter, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow. As the night deepened, Clara felt a sense of peace she had never known before. Philippe's absence was still felt, but it was no longer a source of grief. Instead, it was a reminder of how far they had come together, even in the short time they had shared. For the first time, Clara truly believed in the future she was building, not just for herself, but for Amelie and the legacy Philippe had entrusted to them. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button to show your support. Your feedback helps us keep creating more amazing stories for you. We'd also love to hear from you. What part of this story had the biggest impact on you? Was it the emotional journey, the relationship between Clara and Philippe, or something else? Let us know in the comments below. Have a story idea you'd like to see on the channel? Whether it's a heartfelt drama, a gripping mystery, or a tale of redemption, drop your suggestions in the comments. Who knows? Your idea might inspire our next video. Thanks for being part of our storytelling community. Your engagement makes all the difference.